A few weeks ago, I moved to a sleepy little town called Meadow Lakes in Alaska, about an hour north of Anchorage. I'll admit, as a software developer, I never thought that I would be living in a remote town in Alaska, seemingly 1,000 miles from nowhere, but I couldn't refuse the offer. This hot new AI startup, based in none other than San Francisco, was looking to break new ground by gathering real-world data from remote regions of the world that had been mostly untouched by technology. The project pitch certainly sounded interesting to me, but I would be lying if I didn't admit the main driver was a free house and a $250,000 salary. And the move couldn't have been easier too. I still lived with my parents, so there wasn't much for the movers to page up and take to the new house. And my amazing new salary meant that I could realistically buy whatever I needed once I had settled. It was a 2-day trip from the East Coast to Anchorage, from which I simply had an hour's drive to my new residence. When I finally arrived around noon on the second day of my travel, I was pleasantly surprised to find that not only did all my stuff make it to the house, but it was fully furnished as well. A kitchen full of appliances, a living room with a sectional and a recliner. Admittedly, I only cared about the recliner, but the only thing missing was a bed. Not a big deal for me since I was known to fall asleep in my chair back at home anyway. No sense in changing habits now. Just as I had come back downstairs from touring the rest of my new house, which was entirely too big for a bachelor such as myself, I heard a knock at the door. Upon answering the knock, I was greeted by a rather skinny, middle-aged man with dark gray hair and one of the goofiest smiles that I had ever seen. "Oh, good morning, mister," the man said cheerfully. "You must be the newcomer that everybody's been talking about. Anyway, my name's Lenny Stringer, and I'm your neighbor just next door. Feel free to stop by and ask for anything at all," Lenny said in the sweetest demeanor with almost childlike innocence about him. And then Lenny's face immediately switched to a more serious look. "And most importantly, do not under any circumstances answer the door at 12:04. After exchanging pleasantries with Lenny, I mentioned that I was tired from all the traveling, but that I would connect with him later in the week. Not answering the door at 12:04 seemed oddly specific, though Lenny did seem rather odd in other ways. So perhaps he was only warning me about people causing trouble late at night. This was a rather remote region of the country after all. I had spent the remainder of the day unpacking the few boxes of things that I had moved from my parents' house just to get it all out of the way. If I hadn't done so immediately, then anything left in a box would probably stay that way. The sun had set at this point in the day, and I was settled into my new recliner and dozing off. It felt as if my eyes had only been closed for 5 minutes when I jumped awake, nearly falling out of my chair at the sound of a loud banging on the front door. Without thinking, I quickly walked over and opened the door. "You didn't even look at the time now, did you? Do you want to ruin your life?" Lenny said in an oddly terrified voice. Whatever nonsense he was spewing at this point, he certainly seemed to believe it. "All right, Lenny, I'll pay close attention to the time next time," I said in a rather condescending and annoyed tone. Lenny walked away with a nod as I closed the front door and made for my chair in the living room. Although Lenny's interruption was rather irritating, I've always had a knack for quickly falling back asleep more often than not. This time must not have been much different from the usual, because I barely remember reclining my chair before passing back out. There were 3 knocks, and I was once again yanked out of a deep slumber by the sound of somebody hammering on the front door. This time I looked at my watch and sure enough it said 12:04 a.m. Clearly Lenny was committed to whatever fantasy was going on in his mind, but my patience was wearing thin, and I fully planned on letting him know exactly how I felt about getting woken up by nonsense twice in the same night. A few minutes later, I decided to walk up to the door and say, "Lenny, I know it's you. I remembered your silly warning about 1204, so here." I waited to answer though. "Now can you stop knocking on my door so that I can get some dang peace and quiet?" The knocking had immediately stopped and there was nothing but silence. Completely uninterested in seeing Lenny's face again, I turned back towards the living room. Upon taking the first step away from the front door, I heard a chilling voice that seemed like it was Lenny. Please, I'm not playing this time. Something's wrong. I don't feel right." Annoyed at how much I cared about a man that I had only met less than a day ago, I opened the front door. Except there was no one around. I flicked on the floodlight and there were no signs of movement in any direction. "Alright, this needs to stop, Lenny," I yelled in both anger and frustration. Upon receiving no response, I backed up into the kitchen and slammed the door shut. I told myself if Lenny knocks again, I'm immediately going to call the police and let them sort it out. Upon turning around, I felt like my heart had stopped as my eyes caught sight of a dark figure rushing towards me. Before I could react, something hit me in the head and everything cut to black. I awoke the next morning on the kitchen floor with a heck of a headache, but my primary focus was immediately dialing 911 and connecting with the local sheriff. I told the sheriff about my neighbor attacking me in my own home last night, and to my surprise, he was there with a few other squad cars in about 15 minutes. As I frantically started explaining to the sheriff about Lenny, his stupid greeting and warning and the fact that he attacked me in my own home, the sheriff cut me off. "Now there's a lot to unpack here," said the sheriff in an authoritative but understanding voice. "You'll want to come to the station to clarify a few things, submit an official statement and sign some paperwork. I can drive you." This seemed a little odd to me, but who was I to question a small-town sheriff? After all, he and his team were quite responsive to my call. When we arrived at the station, the sheriff said, "First things first, we need to make sure that we're looking for the right guy. Look at this screen over here and point to the man who attacked you, if you will." The computer screen that he pointed to seemed relatively modern, but the photos currently being displayed on it looked as if they were taken by a retro camera. Regardless, it was clear as day which one was Lenny, so without much thought, I pointed straight at his picture. "I see," said the sheriff in a concerned voice. "I'll be right back." I immediately began to wonder if Lenny wasn't who he said he was, or perhaps he was somebody who had been wanted for quite some time. None of these scenarios running through my mind had prepared me for the old newspaper that the sheriff had handed me. Lenny's picture was on the front page as clear as day, but the headline read, "Local man Lenny Stringer brutally murdered in his own home." Further down it continues with, "Around 12:04 a.m., neighbors reported yelling and screaming. No suspects have been named." I could immediately feel the color draining from my face. Was it some sort of sick joke the town liked to play on newcomers to scare them off? This couldn't possibly be real. Sensing my disbelief, the sheriff broke the silence. Yeah, this was a famous case back in the day. Poor Lenny was barely recognizable when they found him. They never did catch who done it, mainly because nobody knew who would do that to Lenny. No need to worry though, that happened 100 years ago today. Even if the killer was a toddler at that point, they'd be dead and gone by now. After this ridiculous story from the sheriff, I decided to ask for a ride home. Upon my arrival, I immediately started researching this Lenny nonsense. There was no way that what they were telling me was real. And yet every news outlet that I landed on seemed to confirm the sheriff's recollection, which was far more chilling than the town potentially being out to get me. As previously stated, this was a few weeks ago now. I haven't been attacked, nor have I seen any sign of Lenny since that day that I talked to the sheriff. Credit where credit is due. I'm likely attack-free since I now heed Lenny's warning. Every night when I receive a knock at the door at 12:04, I ignore it, no matter what sounds are on the other side. I refuse to answer no matter who is asking. And before you recommend simply abandoning the job and moving, this happens to me everywhere I go now. I dread the day when I accidentally answer the door at this godforsaken time and find out what happens when I slip up a second time.